Hello, everyone. Welcome to this introduction to the criticality of cybersecurity in IT infrastructure. My name is Robin Tatum. I'm the Director of Security Technologies at Health Systems, and it's my distinct pleasure to provide this information to you. If you have any questions or comments about the content contained in this webinar, please feel free to reach out to me via my phone number or my email address listed on this slide, and I will be more than happy to assist you. Now, as I grew up as a teen, audio was delivered in this record format, and that was really the only way between that and cassettes that we knew how to listen to the music that we listened to. Even though this has made somewhat of a comeback in recent years, the technology has largely been replaced by either compact disc or, more commonly nowadays even, streaming audio. With computer data, we have similar historical information being stored on traditional medium, such as paper files, although a lot of this now, of course, has been replaced by more electronic storage formats. It used to be back in the day that you go, say, to the doctor's office and you would see rack upon rack of these paper files that would be used to access your medical information. If you went from one doctor to another, there was really very little, if any, sharing of this information, and you really had to start from scratch all over again. The only way to secure that data was to put it into a locking storage facility, either a drawer-based file cabinet or some type of safe or vault. Turn the key or twist the lock, secure that information physically. Now, this was a pretty simple process back in the 60s and 70s. When we got into the 80s and early 90s, we started to see a shift towards starting to use technology to share and store this information. It was a pretty simple process to begin with, oftentimes just maybe having a single PC, or back in the advent of the power system days and the predecessor known as the AS400, it was pretty much a point-to-point connection between the person sitting at the terminal and the database stored on the server. There wasn't much possibility of it being accessed from somebody outside the organization, because they'd have to physically be able to access the terminal and, of course, also have credentials and satisfy any other security controls that were in place. As we moved into the 90s and early 2000s, of course, we saw an explosion in the proliferation of these technology devices, many times becoming more and more interconnected, and also then, of course, sharing the data that was stored upon them. And when you look at the pictures on this cover of Newsweek, it certainly doesn't seem but more than a few weeks since some of these things occurred. It's certainly very much in the very recent past. But what's shocking about that is that this actually was from 2015, and since then, more data has been created than in the prior 5,000 years of humanity. Granted, there probably wasn't a deal of data collection happening back in that day, certainly compared with where we are today. So this is more a statement of how exponentially fast the collection and storage of data is happening. A lot of this data is stored in an unformatted form. It's video, it's audio clips. And so that's generating a lot of the sizable amount of data that we're collecting. But if you're interested in learning more about this growth of data, check out the link that I've put on the slide here and see, in essence, what's happening in that storage realm. But regardless of the type of data you're storing, be it video or audio or traditional, more data-oriented information, it's all under scrutiny. Someone somewhere has a vested interest in discovering what you have stored. They're watching it. They're looking to see if anything's being posted or stored that might allow them to have an advantage in some way or benefit from that information. If you're part of a business structure environment, then there's, of course, a value in knowing what your competitors are doing. Now, you are most likely working, and hopefully working, for an ethical company that doesn't engage in industrial espionage, but there's a good chance that if you came across information pertaining to perhaps the activities of a competitor, that it's been discovered somehow, it's been shared, and it's been utilized in order to give a distinct competitive advantage. And of course, there's ways to do this that are ethical and legitimate, but at the end of the day, it's very important as part of a business that you turn a profit usually, and of course gaining that competitive advantage is something that you really work hard to do. Hopefully that's being done through the quality of products and services that your organization offers, but you know, really as part of the Fortune 500, we see a lot of organizations where there are questions with regards to how they have performed, how they have accessed their information or won their contracts. Some of these have been very high profile and ultimately have led to the downfall of the entire organization. In some instances, they've also led to the creation of a regulatory mandate. In the case of Enron, big contributor to the necessity for a control such as Sarbanes-Oxley, or SOX as it's better known, that mandates how companies do business and the controls and process and oversight that has to be in place in order to ensure that they're acting ethically. We also have basic cyber criminals who are leveraging information or accessing systems in order to gain some type of personal advantage, whether it's a financial one or part of leverage. There's always an incentive for people to take advantage of that type of information, to try to access it. This is kind of where we talk about hacking and in other types of infiltration of an environment. These types of crimes often are handled through some form of cryptocurrency. Bitcoin has certainly been in the headlines a lot through its massive growth in value over the last few years. I don't think many of us have probably missed that type of announcement, but the interesting thing, again, is anytime there is a human involved, there is always somebody out there who's trying to benefit. And even these cryptocurrencies, which are not inherently evil, they're just used in ways because they're hard to trace, they have also fallen victim in some instances to their own type of fraud. In this case, the idea that scammers are, in essence, trying to rip off people that are trying to jump on the bandwagon with regards to the very well-documented and popular growth in the value of these currencies, such as Bitcoins. We also have physical information theft. Here, what you're seeing on the slide is the image of a credit card skimmer, the idea being that it looks very similar to the official skim mechanism of, say, an ATM device or a point of sale. Insert your card. Not only does it read the magnetic stripe in order to provide the vendor with the transaction information, but it also is storing that or transmitting that information to somebody who is not authorized to the data. A lot of times this does circumvent, you know, the controls that we have physically in place. A lot of times, especially in North America, we have a tendency to hand over our credit cards even to somebody who then walks away with it, maybe to the other side of the store or the restaurant, in order to actually run that card. Of course, this is a very obvious source of threat. I think we all know that the idea of handing our credit or debit card over to somebody is probably not the best idea, but we just generally accept that here in North America. Other parts of the world, not so much. There are mobile point-of-sale systems that are brought to you. You never hand your card over, and we're starting to see certainly more of that now as we have the advent of this new chip and signature technology in the U.S. The idea of a chip is not new. It's been used in other parts of the world for many years, oftentimes in association with a PIN number that gets entered. In the U.S., they've implemented chip and signature. So you insert the card into the reader. It pulls the encrypted data from the chip, which is much more difficult to emulate or read if you're not an authorized user. And then that data is used in conjunction with a signature in order to approve a particular transaction. Health insurance information has also become a very popular target of criminals. When you think about an actual theft, even if it's of financial data, if somebody happens to come across or obtain your credit card number and you notice those questionable transactions and you call your credit card company, usually the first act is that they're going to cancel the card or reassign the number and issue you a new card. With health insurance information or health information in general, it's more difficult to do that. I can't change my date of birth. I can't change my medical history. So if somebody actually finds or leverages that information, there's really not a tremendous amount that I can do about it. And so this data is more resaleable, perhaps, than financial data ever could be. Now, why would somebody ever want to know about my birthday and my medical history? Well, really what they're after is leveraging in two ways. One is if you have health insurance and they don't, then they can sell that or utilize that in order to gain use of your insurance. As far as your health information, it gives them additional insight into your life and to you as a person. And this is something that can be leveraged in a number of different ways, even if it's simply to target you with a more credible message, which we're going to talk about in just a second. HIPAA, which is the Health Information Portability Accountability Act, a bit of a mouthful there, is designed to oversee the use and storage of medical-related data. Interestingly, despite HIPAA, we do see a tremendous amount of non-compliance. In fact, this is a website maintained by the Department of Health and Human Services that tracks open HIPAA investigations. And the ones you see on the slide here are just part of the number of open investigations that were happening just in 1 month alone. Of course, Social Security number in the United States is well known and well documented as private information that you want to keep private. Now, somebody obtaining this type of information could potentially represent themselves as you. There are many cases where people have filed early tax returns and gained refunds in the name of somebody else utilizing their Social Security number. And in essence, what we're looking at here is the concept of what we call identity theft, where somebody is, in essence, representing themselves to be somebody they are not, and then using that position to gain some type of advantage. In some instances, there are cases where loans are perhaps established and assets are purchased in the name of somebody else. I actually had a friend who had a camper purchased in their name, even though they had no awareness of this. The person had, in essence, used their credit in order to establish a loan, providing the information so that they didn't have to pay it back. The person that is the unwitting victim, perhaps, is then receiving a bill for a very large purchase that they did not make. International espionage is something that has happened since the dawn of time. From an IT perspective, of course, it's a little bit newer, but it is certainly something that I would imagine just about every country on the planet engages in. This is something typically spoken about more in Hollywood films, at least until recently. I think there's a lot more evidence now between the scandal over the U.S. presidential election in 2016 to a number of other cases where it has been traced back to various countries that have engaged or at least sponsored these types of criminal acts. Now, this infiltration often is happening by people we know as hackers. These are the bad guys. Really, though, the term hacking is simply the access of computer systems, so it doesn't necessarily guarantee that a hacker is a bad guy. So we have a term known as black hats that typically refer to the people that are performing this type of infiltration in order to gain some type of benefit. Usually it is a monetary benefit. They are often contract for hires. They are working for some type of criminal syndicate or even a national government in order to perform these hacks for somebody else. We also have good guys in the hacking world. These are known as white hats. They're often performing legitimate penetration testing. The difference really is that while they're acting in often the same way, they're doing it with a different objective. In the case of the white hats, the term is used to describe somebody who is looking for vulnerabilities that they are then going to share with their client or their employer so that those vulnerabilities can be addressed. So the goal here is to act as a black hat, in essence, try to gain access, but to do it for good, to do it for the benefit of the person that has asked them to do it. In fact, there are certifications out there. One is the Certified Ethical Hacker, which is a way of legitimizing what you do. Now, of course, we have to be careful because there are people that straddle that fence a little bit. They may be bringing to the attention of an organization a particular vulnerability, but perhaps on their spare time or in other ways that they're doing things that are perhaps not as legitimate. So definitely any access to computer systems has to be closely overseen regardless of the intent and the benefit in doing so. We often have to consider the threat associated with what we call insiders. And really, this is a control or set of controls that apply to the oversight of those that we have granted access to. So a company has a number of employees. They're probably going to have some type of network access. They're going to have applications that they use in order to perform their business role. But of course, it's not unheard of, in fact, quite common for people to take advantage of this access, using it in ways that companies don't expect, and getting access to the type of information, perhaps, again, that benefits them personally. It's not uncommon for companies to feel vulnerable to this type of threat, and it really is not surprising to me because when you think about the biggest challenge that faces hackers, it's usually accessing the environment. And in the case of insiders, they've been given the keys pretty much as part of their employment. So the ability for us to track those users, to control those users, really now becomes paramount because they have the keys to access pretty much all of those systems. Some pretty documented high-profile cases of insider threat have occurred. Nike, the clothing and sports manufacturer, recently had an organization employee who was fired. He was an account executive, and he was using access to the environment that he had legitimately as an employee to provide massive discounts to other organizations, two of which primarily were ones that he was a part owner of. So in essence, he would get orders from, in essence, his company, and instead of the 3 to maybe 7% discount that Nike gave to its best partners, he was assigning up to 65% discounts to his company, and then forging the signatures on the payment checks to Nike to come from his business partner, thereby not disclosing that he was part of that organization. That's something that went on for a couple of years before they caught on. Columbia Sportswear had a case of their own whereby a high-ranking member of their IT organization actually resigned voluntarily, but before he left, created a separate network account which he leveraged then in order to gain access to email servers and, of course, proprietary information. Now, when he left Columbia, he went to work for another company that actually was a provider for Columbia, and they were an IT company, and so they were using the inside information to discover what initiatives Columbia was working on. They were establishing partnership relationships in order to be able to quote and deliver products and services, and of course doing that in a way that was not ethical or even legal. So you know, you really have to watch out for this, even after the people are gone, making sure that their accounts are shut down, but also having visibility to their actions to see, in this case, if somebody is creating a new account that is being leveraged after the employee is gone. If you're not familiar with the Ponemon Institute, then I would certainly say become so, and you can Google and find that information. They are the publisher of the Cost of a Data Breach study that gets published every year, and according to their statistics, the cost of a data breach is something that is, of course, growing over time. And when we look at statistics, we see that there's a 1 in 960,000 chance of being struck by lightning. Even though we all are concerned when we're out in a lightning storm, it's a pretty slim chance that we're ever going to see any type of impact from that. If you're in the dating scene, you might be excited to know that your chances of meeting and dating a millionaire are much better. In fact, 1 in 220. So that's something on the positive side. Unfortunately, on the negative side, we have the positive chance of you experiencing a data breach at a phenomenal 1 in 4. So this really is not a matter of if, but more a matter of when, and definitely, therefore, something you want to have on your radar with regards to putting the necessary controls in place. Now, when it comes to cyber threat and attacks, there's a lot of different flavors of these, and we're going to just share with you a few of the most common, perhaps best known approaches that criminals use. DDoS is a term we use in order to talk about somebody attacking an environment in order to, in essence, prevent it being used legitimately. So denial of service attack is what that stands for, distributed denial of service attack. And really the goal here for the person enacting it is to swamp or overwhelm the server they're trying to connect with in order to prevent it being used in a legitimate form. Some financial organizations have been victim of this over the last few years. In fact, this was a pretty targeted attack. Supposedly, it was being done in the name of politics or religion. Somebody didn't agree with how banks were handling money, and they wanted to cause them harm. Now, of course, there are many that think that that is really just a cover-up, that the denial of service attack is there so people focus their attention on trying to recover from it, while in the meantime they're using it as a diversionary technique in order to do other things. Certainly still common, still something that most organizations face. Now, if you're somebody who is on email, you will probably get a lot of emails that are coming from people that are representing themselves as somebody else, or they are purporting to be somebody they are not, in order for you to provide either your credentials or your financial information that they can leverage. This is known as a phishing attack. It's typically delivered through email, and their goal is for you to click a link to go to a malicious website or to open an attachment that is perhaps infected with a virus in order to now get their hooks into you. I think this really started back in the day with pretty simple attacks of things such as somebody purporting to be an African prince and wanting to provide large sums of money to anybody who would be willing to help them with a small financial contribution up front. I think we all recognize those types of attacks these days, often populated with misspellings and very, very questionable deals. That has, of course, like everything, evolved. We now have the term spear phishing, where we're using a more targeted approach. I've received several emails over the last few weeks from Amazon Prime talking about the fact that they appreciate my order and that if I click this link and answer a small survey, that they'll be willing to provide me with a $25 gift card. Much more believable process. I am an Amazon customer frequently, and so there's a good chance that I've placed an Amazon order, as with millions of other people around the world. The idea of a $25 gift card is much more believable than multiple millions of dollars, so there's a good chance that they're going to have great success with that type of email campaign. But when you look at the sender of the email, you'll see that the email address behind the name that appears is often coming from a questionable location or a questionable domain. Unfortunately, this is something that many, many people fall victim to. In fact, the open rate of phishing emails in 2016 was upwards of 60%, which is quite staggering. We still have good old brute force attacks as well, whereby somebody will write a script and, in essence, try to barrel their way in by trying to connect thousands of times a second using a computer script. Having good security practices is really going to be your best defense here. Good password policy, ensuring that people have longer passwords than the simple 1, 2, 3 characters, because, of course, anytime you run a script, eventually somebody will get in. So we want to make sure that they are deflected, discovered, and protected against as part of a script like that running. Malware is kind of an advanced version of a virus. Viruses have been around really since virtually the beginning of the IT era, but they've really, again, evolved into very advanced, complex pieces of code. Now, in 2017, we saw a big increase in the number of ransomware attacks as well, and the type of targets that they're going after. And really the intent here, again, even from those phishing and spear phishing attacks, is often for you to infect yourself with a virus by clicking that link embedded in the email. Once that code is running and active, there's lots of things it can do. It can log your keystrokes as you connect to your banking application online. It can install code that is then encrypting your files so that they can request a ransom in order to provide you with the key to unlock them. So lots of things that can happen here that we really need to defend against. Of course, antivirus is a well-known technology. You want to make sure that's employed. You also want to make sure that the signature files are updated constantly so that you're getting the latest threat protection. And you also want to make sure you have good backup. So if you do, unfortunately, become the victim of something like ransomware, you have the ability to be able to recover from it. If you've ever seen a screen like this, you're probably unfortunate enough to be in a situation where you have been the victim of, say, ransomware. Again, the virtual currency, the Bitcoin in this instance that's being used is a way for the criminals to receive payment, and it'd be quite difficult for anybody to trace who it went to. So that's their way of anonymizing themselves from this process. Of course, if you do find yourself in this situation, the professional recommendation is that you do not pay any ransom, simply because there's no guarantee that you'll get the files back, and certainly that ransom can continue to be increased, just as it would in a traditional sense. There's definitely downfall there, but I know a lot of people that have paid that. They have got those files back, and in some instances, very strangely, and to much chuckling usually when I tell people this story, in one instance, the victim was contacted after making payment, and they were told that if they made did a review, in essence, of the process of unlocking their files, acted as a reference, if you will, then their ransom would be refunded. So it was almost like they were running a legitimate business and wanted the customer reviews in order to entice other people to actually follow through and pay the ransom. Quite amazing. Exploitation of configuration has been one of the most common avenues that organizations have fallen victim over the last couple of years. Really what this speaks to is the idea that there are security controls within many operating systems. There are configurations of things like firewalls and in-user provisioning. And if you don't get those configurations correct, and if you don't maintain and oversee them, a misconfiguration can lead to somebody taking advantage of the situation. Now, this is the case often in the power system space where we talk about how secure the platform is, where the reality is that, yes, it is absolutely securable, but it doesn't come that way out of its default configuration. So if you simply install the server, boot up the operating system, and start using your applications, you're actually in a wide open stance, not a secured stance, and somebody could, in essence, take advantage or exploit that configuration. It doesn't mean there's anything inherently weak. It just means we haven't done the necessary steps or taken the necessary steps in order to ensure that our configuration is as secure as it possibly can be. Because of this ongoing breach environment, what we see is governments and organizations and industries establishing rules and regulations that are designed to help protect us. They, in essence, are providing the minimum necessary steps that have to be taken in order to have any sense of security in place. Some examples of these include Sarbanes-Oxley, as I mentioned earlier, HIPAA, PCI, which is for credit cards, GLBA, which is for the financial institutions, GDPR, which is for any organization storing data on residents or citizens of the European Union. So this is something that is pretty prevalent pretty much to every industry and every organization around the world, regardless of your geography or size. Now, in some instances, the rules and regulations really just speak to, your own internal policy being the baseline. But in many instances, there are organizations that step into that. Now, if you're one of those that doesn't have to deal with a government or an industry regulation, be glad to some extent, but also understand that that doesn't completely let you off the hook. There's still a responsibility to your customers, your employer, your employees, your business partners, your shareholders, in order for your environment to be deemed secure, we want to make sure the applications are usable to those that have a business need. We want to make sure that the data that the executives are using in order to make good business decisions is accurate and timely, and we want to make sure that those that shouldn't be accessing the environment are kept out and we're aware of their attempts. So how do we fight back against a lot of these types of risks? Of course, we have to understand what the risks are to start with, and then we have lots of opportunity to start mitigating. First step for me is to ensure that you're running on robust hardware. The Power System Server is such hardware. It has an amazing number of security and technology features that make it a very robust environment. Security is more about just protection of data. It's also going to include making sure that the applications and the data are served and available to the people that need them in a timely manner. Making sure that the server is up and running is a basic part of that, and the Power Server obviously has a phenomenal reputation as being reliable hardware. We also have to make sure we're using a robust operating system. You're probably aware of the operating systems that see many of the attacks and fall victim to those oftentimes. IBM i, formerly known as OS400, that runs on the Power Platform, is an operating system that has phenomenal security capability built right in. But again, the caveat is that it is not pre-configured in many instances. So the expectation that you are secure inherently by running on this server with this operating system is a significant fallacy and one that you need to address. So if you've never had somebody look at your system to determine whether the controls are configured correctly, you definitely want to do so that you don't fall victim to that exploitation type attack that I mentioned earlier. These controls are great. They work really well, but only if you use them. So it's important to not only have the controls, to make sure you give them the care and feeding they need in order to assure you that they are protecting your environment and adding value to the environment. Unfortunately, many operating systems, many technology systems are not configured correctly. And when it comes to the Power Server, Help Systems publishes a state of security study every year that speaks about some of the common misconfiguration elements in our environment and on our platform. So if you've not seen this study before, head out to helpsystems.com. You'll find that as a free download under the Resources tab, and you can take advantage of that. Maybe see if your system has some similar vulnerabilities that need to be addressed as many of the organizations that we look at year after year. Firewall technology is something that has been around for a long time. It's pretty mature at this point. Hopefully you have a perimeter set around your environment. And the goal of this type of technology is to filter the inbound and outbound traffic connecting to your environment to ensure that it's coming from a legitimate source and in a legitimate user profile. Firewalls are incredibly important for protecting against those types of attacks that we talked about a little bit earlier. But we want to make sure that we don't have what we call the M&M defense, where we have a crispy coating on the outside and then soft and gooey in the middle. We want to make sure that our firewall is not the only technology. Arguably, it's one of the most important, but if somebody has either legitimate access or they've gained access to the inside, we want to make sure we have additional layers in place in order to protect ourselves against that. Logging and monitoring your systems is incredibly important. We talked about those white hats doing pen testing, and that's a big part of most regulatory compliance mandates. But simply knowing what's happening on your system is one of the base requirements for pretty much any security program. Unfortunately, we still come across servers where the auditing function that's included in the operating system is turned off and inactive. Unfortunately, in that situation, even if there was a glaring security breach, there would simply be no trace of it, no notification that it was occurring, because without that logging and event monitoring turned on, you have no way to know. We also want to contemplate encryption, which is the process of turning readable information and making it non-readable. It doesn't attempt to hide the information. It's not pretending that the file doesn't exist. It simply makes it unreadable in human form. The benefit of this is that if somebody does gain access to the data and they're doing so in an unauthorized fashion, the value that they can obtain from that data is severely hampered by the fact that nobody can read it. Of course, that depends on using strong encryption standards, using good encryption keys and everything else so that the encryption can't be broken. But this is especially effective to simple prying eyes, where somebody perhaps is performing a crime of circumstance where they come across data that they potentially see as valuable, and maybe they know that their position is threatened, so they download that data and take it with them. This is especially effective to that because most likely they're not going to know how to attempt to decrypt the data. One of the challenges many organizations run into is that the acknowledgement that when somebody connects into their environment, we have to assume that it was the intended person and not somebody who has simply guessed, fished for, or broken the user's credentials. When we see people using password 123 as the password, it doesn't take much to think that that's going to be broken. So when that account is connected, how do we have any assurance that the user doing so is not somebody who is outside of the organization? We have a technology known as multi-factor authentication. You're probably familiar with this and maybe don't even know it. But if you think about your ATM card, when you go to the physical ATM and you put in your card, that's something you have in your possession. Hopefully only you do. But it's definitely possible for somebody to have captured the card data and created a secondary card that looks just like yours. How we control that somebody can't do that and then walk away with the contents of our bank account is that we protect it with a special, unique, usually a 4- to 6-digit number that then is something that remains in our head. That's why we tell people don't ever write it on a piece of paper and put it in your wallet or write it on the card. It's because then you have both pieces of information, or you have the information and the physical card, and that's where you're going to be in trouble. Multi-factor authentication is done often through cell phones. If you've logged into a website recently for online banking or a government service, there's a good chance that it sent a code to the registered number associated with the account. And if you don't have access to that physical device, then obviously you don't have the missing component that would allow you access to the service you're trying to use. Plus, the registered user of that account has just got a notification that you tried to log in, and they're now aware of that. So it's a great way of assuring that the person connecting is actually the intended person and not somebody masquerading. This is something that we can do way beyond ATMs. We can do it even on IBMI so that when you sign in, you're provided with a code that has to be entered as well, again, assuring that you're the legitimate user. So the key here is that the tools are often available. In the power systems world, we're very, very lucky to be serviced and have access to a lot of capabilities that help improve our security stance, but these tools are only going to be useful if we use them. So I can't emphasize that enough. So often we look at IBMI servers and they're simply not leveraging those controls, and it's a real shame because part of the power of the platform is that capability. Baseline monitoring is a technique that a lot of organizations use in order to determine noncompliance, be that noncompliance with a regulatory mandate or even just simply internal security policy. What we're doing here is defining to the system how it should look and then determining if the current stance mirrors that. So if a setting change or a configuration file or a database element is altered, upon next check, we will then see that there is an element of noncompliance and we can address that. Now, the problem with baseline monitoring is that if the baseline is only altered, or excuse me, the system is only altered against the baseline for a very short period of time, then it may get missed. If I change a system value in the IBMI world, do a task and then change the system value back, and you only check that element once a month, then there's a good chance you won't even have seen that it changed in that window of time. So it's a very handy control. It's a very great process to go after, but we just got to recognize its strengths and its weaknesses. We want to maybe consider automation as well in all of this. I don't know about you, but I don't really want my full-time job to be checking objects to see if they have the right ownership or the right public authority settings, my system values are set correctly, my exit programs are still registered. So one of the big benefits of the platform is that we can run processes and programs in batch behind the scenes and let it do that heavy lifting for us. At the end of the day, my responsibility as a security person is to address the vulnerabilities and to respond to events. If I can have the system monitor the events for me and simply tell me when they occur or bring to my attention the ones that it feels are of interest to me, then I've eliminated probably 90% of the mundane day-to-day work that otherwise I would be required to do. User education also can have the biggest impact on reducing cyber risk. Again, the prevalence of users receiving, opening, and clicking links in emails is still startling. So you have to educate on how to recognize a good spear phishing attack. These emails now look so legitimate that we have to be sharper, we have to be smarter when it comes to determining whether they are real or not, and tell people to err on the side of caution. So this is definitely a growth area. There's a lot of people that I think just assume that people know not to click hyperlinks, but with the click-through rate that we continue to see, that's obviously not the case, especially when these emails look more and more legitimate all the time. I mentioned applying controls in layers when we talked about the firewall, and I'm a big believer in that. You want to make sure that there's multiple layers of controls in order to protect the environment against simply a perimeter attack that breaks through. We want to make sure we have internal controls to make sure that the users connecting to the servers have business need in order to do so. The skill in implementing all these layers is to do so that it appears relatively transparent to those of us that are legitimately accessing the environment. Our goal is not to hamper every step of the way, but in order to provide the necessary controls in order to protect the environment, but still let people do their day-to-day role. When you do this, you can just sit back and relax, take it easy, not have to worry about anything, right? Well, unfortunately, no. Of course, we see that threats continue to evolve. The technology we use in our environment changes. I mean, just think about 10 years ago, the idea of bringing a device to work. I mean, even that term sounds funny. In order to connect into the environment. 24/7 data access through web pages and applications is now the normal. It's expected for your customers. And so we have to consider that evolution as we define how our security controls are going to work, determine where the threats are coming from, and put remediation controls in place. So this is a lifestyle now. This is not a set and forget. It's not an IT project like most others. We don't move on from security. We continue to work it and evolve it to ensure that it provides us with the necessary protection. That way, hopefully, as we move forward into the coming years, the technology that maybe many of us don't even know about or think about that has yet to appear on the horizon is something that we can accommodate as we define out our security plans, our compliance needs for the years to come. Your best bet in doing all of this is to find somebody who can help you, of course. If you're not a security expert, if you don't want to be a security or compliance expert, then there are people out there that are more than happy to do that. I'm very proud to work for Help Systems because we have a good security solution set that is product-based, but we also have a very complementary team that is enacting security controls, is available for penetration testing, risk assessments, vulnerability testing, and remediation work. So we're not only focusing on software solutions, we also want to make sure we're architecting the necessary foundation using IBM I and the Power Systems platform, and even beyond. The solutions now, AIX, Linux, Windows, any of these operating systems fall into our sites, and we're helping many organizations with them. So if you do have an interest in learning more about security or compliance, whether it's on the Power Platform or beyond, feel free to leverage the experts at Help Systems in order to assist you with those tasks in any capacity that you need us to. All right, well, that's the end of the presentation today. If you do have any questions, feel free to reach out to us. You can use the email address I provided at the beginning to contact me directly. Otherwise, just head out to helpsystems.com where you'll find information about our products and our services, as well as a contact page so that you can ask any specific questions that you may have. Again, thank you for joining me today. I look forward to speaking with you on an upcoming session, and let us know if there's anything we can do to help you. Have a great day, everybody. Bye-bye.